Welcome to homework.
In this question, we're given a scenario in which there is an aquatic biome. Let's say in this example, there's a lake, and there is an overabundance of producers relative to the number of consumers. And in a aquatic biome, that could be aquatic plants, it could be kelp, it could be algae, phytoplankton, basically any primary producer or thing that undergoes photosynthesis or some other abiotic form of forming energy uh, that exists in an aquatic biome. And immediately, when looking at this, you might be quick to discount option A. After all, wouldn't an increase in primary producers who, through photosynthesis, release oxygen actually lead to the opposite of oxygen depletion? Well, that might be a logical answer to this, but as always, let's run through our options just to make sure we're not leaving anything out. So, our next answer choice, option B, makes this claim about a basal energy source. And basal energy source would be the base, basal, of the energy in this ecosystem. And as we all know, the basal energy source of any ecosystem is the primary producer, which would be the beings that are literally in overabundance given the example in the prompt. As a result, what is described in option B is the exact opposite of the reality in this example. So that would be automatically out. All right, well, we've already discounted one, so let's see about option C. In this case, we're talking about uh, carbon sequestering. This is a real phenomenon that conservationists and ecologists are using to try to decrease the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by a variety of methods to sequester or take that carbon dioxide and place it and hold it somewhere. A really great place for that are in forests or places with primary producers that store a lot of carbon dioxide. So in this case, you might have a really large forest that takes in a bunch of CO2. In an aquatic environment, then, you would expect with more primary producers that more carbon would be sequestered. And so again, it seems that by the definitions of these terms, option C is automatically out. All right, that gives us one final answer choice, option D, which seems a little nonsensical, and that is probably because it is. Um, this is one of those answer choices that's thrown in to sort of throw you off the trail, or at least to help make it easier to answer the problem, depending on how you read it. Um, if anything, there are more producers than consumers, then some dead consumers might not be getting eaten, depending on the relative abundance of their consumers, but then they wouldn't really be undigestible, they just wouldn't be digested, I suppose. But in any case, option D is just not holding any, it does not hold any bearing on this problem. But that still leaves us going back to option A. And again, we might be thinking, well, doesn't that also go against the basic definitions of these terms? Well, I can see how that might make sense, but we are forgetting a real world example of a case when primary producers would find themselves in overabundance in an aquatic environment. And that is the algal bloom. Algal blooms are cases where, particularly in lakes, an overabundance of algae suddenly pops up, usually due to an increase of nitrogen or phosphorus into the water. And what happens is, as this population increases, algae tend to condense near the surface of the water. And as they condense, they take in a lot of light energy. As a result, this leaves other primary producers who aren't near the surface and don't have access to this light energy, who can't photosynthesize anymore. It leaves them to die. So already we have the first chain reaction after this algal bloom is the death of other primary producers. And you would expect this to happen even if this wasn't algae. If there were other primary producers who happened to be closer to the surface, then they would block the energy from any that were below them in depth-wise. What happens next, as I'm sure you might be aware, algae tend to die off as a natural way of life. Nothing is immortal, as we all know. And when the algae die, that leaves basically no or very, very few primary producers left in order to conduct photosynthesis. And what happens when, in that case, is there becomes no more oxygen, or at least very, very little oxygen. And as a result of that, the organisms that rely on this oxygen in order to breathe or conduct cellular respiration, like these fish, they also die off. And so it might seem a bit counterintuitive, but an initial overabundance of primary producers actually leads to a massive die-off. And as we can see, that is option A, which is our final and correct answer.